Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the stiff leather shoes of an Edwardian housemaid, where your entire self-worth will be judged by how well you can make a doorknob shine. Picture this, it's 1903, and you've just arrived at Huntington Manor with your entire life packed into one cardboard suitcase, about to discover that the brass doorknobs in this house receive more care and attention than you ever will. That ominous squeak as you enter the servants' quarters. That's the sound of your social mobility grinding to a halt, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Whether you're listening from London at midnight or Tokyo over breakfast. Let me know in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world we're collectively polishing doorknobs tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The housekeeper's stare could tarnish silver at 20 paces as she inspects your raw, unworked hands. These will never do, she sniffs, producing a jar of something that smells suspiciously like vinegar and crushed dreams. You'll start with the morning room knobs, they're the easiest to hide mistakes on. The air hangs heavy with beeswax, ammonia, and the faint metallic tang of crushed aspirations. Historians still argue whether Edwardian households were this obsessive about metal polish or if we're just seeing the worst examples. But here's a tarnished truth. That simple, brass polish recipe you're given contains 6 ingredients, including crushed eggshells and a mysterious white powder that makes your nose itch. As you rub the first knob, your reflection warps in its surface, a funhouse mirror version of yourself that will become strangely familiar over the coming months. The housekeeper's manual of domestic management hits your nightstand with a thud that shakes your narrow cot. Page 87 contains the terrifying words, "A speck of tarnish is the moral equivalent of theft from your employer." You'll dream about this sentence, usually while polishing something in your sleep. Morning reveals why. The east-facing doorknobs develop a patina by noon that the lady of the house claims shows moral decay in the staff. Historians still debate whether this was actual concern about metal oxidation or just Victorian class anxiety manifesting strangely. But the proof is in the pudding, or rather, in the butler's secret stash of pre-polished backup knobs he swaps in before important guests arrive. Your first attempt at the 3-stage polishing method leaves your hands smelling like a penny that's been in someone's mouth. The scullery maid whispers the real secret: lemon juice cuts through tarnish faster than judgment. 2 bad lemons cost more than your hourly wage. Dawn polishing becomes your personal hell. There's an exact science to catching the morning light at 47 degrees, the perfect angle to reveal fingerprints. You develop a sixth sense for which guests sleepwalk at night based on which knobs are mysteriously smudged by 5 a.m. Historians still argue whether Edwardians actually believed early morning polishing lasted longer or just enjoyed tormenting servants. But here's the rub: modern chemistry confirms brass does oxidize slower when polished at low humidity. Too bad no one told you about the parlourmaid's trick of breathing on knobs to fake morning dew. Your hands develop permanent stains in the creases, a map of every mistake you've ever made. The house cat watches your struggles with what can only be described as feline schadenfreude before deliberately rubbing against freshly polished surfaces. The knob hierarchy reveals itself like a twisted social ladder. Main entrance first, always, followed by the library, where the master spends his mornings, then the drawing room, where ladies take tea, and finally, if you have any fingerprints left, the servants' quarters. The butler catches you doing them out of order and delivers a lecture about proper priorities that lasts longer than your lunch break. Historians still argue whether this order reflected actual usage or just class prejudice. But here's the dirty secret: the upstairs knobs get polished daily while servants' knobs get a special monthly treatment that mostly consists of being breathed on heavily. you discover the parlor maid's trick of polishing just the sides of lesser knobs that get inspected less. It works until the housekeeper runs her white glove along the top edge. The resulting scolding could strip varnish off furniture. The white glove inspection becomes your personal nightmare. Lady Huntington doesn't even look at the knobs, she just sweeps by while dragging a gloved finger across surfaces. The gloves are washed in some special solution that makes dust stick like evidence at a crime scene. Historians still debate whether these inspections were about cleanliness or control. But the kitchen maid whispers the truth: those special gloves are just starched normal ones. The real test is whether you panic when she approaches. Your first failed inspection results in having to repolish every knob on the second floor. With a toothbrush. The cook takes pity and slips you some vinegar, which works suspiciously well. You don't ask where she got it. Fake polishing becomes an art form. You learn which knobs can be quickly buffed with your apron hem and which need actual effort. The secret is watching the household routines. People rarely touch the backsides of closet doorknobs. Historians still argue how widespread this practice was. But the evidence is literally written on the walls. In one country house, archaeologists found servant graffiti behind a closet knob reading, "Polished this with my tears, 1897. Your system works perfectly until the master's nephew, home from university, starts opening doors unusually." The resulting tarnished trail leads directly to your corner cutting. The housekeeper's disappointed sigh hurts worse than the extra polishing duty. The underground scullery network saves your sanity. Cook's niece slips you a tin of miracle polish that cuts your knob cleaning time in half. The boot boy knows which windows catch the housekeeper's inspection route. Even the stern butler looks the other way when you take an extra 5 minutes with the morning room knobs. His favorite shine reminds him of his military days. Historians still argue whether servant solidarity was common or exaggerated. But here's the tarnished truth: when the lady of the house demands all knobs be repolished during a heat wave, the entire staff suddenly develops polishing-related vapors at once. The resulting chaos forces compromise. Only public areas get the full treatment. Your hands finally stop cracking when the laundry maid shares her lanolin salve. In return, you teach her the three-handkerchief buffing technique. The system works, until the housekeeper notices an unusual shortage of linens. Polishing as punishment reaches new heights of absurdity when you're caught napping in the linen closet. Your sentence: recount and repolish every doorknob in the manor, including the ones hidden behind furniture. The butler, helpfully, produces a 1873 inventory listing 214 knobs, though you swear some were removed during renovations. Historians debate whether this was actual discipline or just keeping servants occupied. But the real punishment comes when you discover the previous punished maid scratched tiny marks behind each knob, a secret tally of injustices. Your addition to the count feels like joining a sad sisterhood, the silver lining. Finding the long-lost maid's knob behind a cabinet, polished to perfection but never touched by household hands. You leave it untouched as a monument to wasted effort. The Industrial Revolution creeps into your polishing rag with terrifying efficiency. New, scientific cleaners promise to have your workload but triple the scrutiny. The housekeeper becomes obsessed with something called germ theory and makes you polish knobs twice, once for shine, once for sanitation. Historians still argue whether new cleaning products improved servants' lives or just raised expectations. But the real change comes when electric lights are installed. Suddenly your afternoon polishing gets inspected under brutal artificial light. That perfect morning shine now shows microscopic flaws at all hours. Your small rebellion. Using the old beeswax formula on the master's study knob, the one place in the house still lit by gaslight. It becomes his favorite without him knowing why. The Great Polish Shortage of 1914 changes everything. One day you're carefully measuring out your daily dollop of brass cleaner, the next you're being handed a jar of dubious homemade substitute that smells like rancid butter and regret. War effort, the housekeeper sniffs, as if that explains why the drawing room knobs now look like dull pennies. Historians still argue whether this was actual scarcity or just households hoarding. But the kitchen maid whispers the truth: the local merchant was caught selling Polish ingredients to munitions factories. Your secret stash of pre-war beeswax becomes more valuable than your quarterly wages. Your experimental polish made from candle wax and kitchen ash works surprisingly well. Until spring humidity turns it into a gray, streaky nightmare. The lady of the house's horrified gasp when she touches a knob could power a small searchlight. The servant's wing knob neglect becomes your quiet rebellion. While the front door gleams for visitors, the staff quarters develop a satisfying patina of disregard. The housekeeper pretends not to notice, though you catch her sneaking a quick polish to the housekeeper's office knob when she thinks no one's looking. Historians debate whether this was conscious class solidarity or just exhaustion. But the evidence is in the fingerprints. While family knobs get daily attention, the servants' bells accumulate years of grime. Your personal victory comes when the boot boy's tarnished door handle leaves a perfect smudge on the master's white gloves during an inspection. The resulting chaos leads to the first, and last, full staff polishing day. By sunset, even the housekeeper admits defeat when the scullery maid accidentally uses furniture oil instead of metal polish. The time-motion study man arrives with his clipboard and stopwatch, determined to optimize your polishing routine. He times your wrist circles, measures your rag folds, and produces a 12-page report concluding you could save 47 seconds per knob by not breathing. Historians still argue whether scientific management helped or humiliated servants. But the real joke comes when his efficiency polish recipe strips the lacquer off the main hall knobs, requiring 3 maids working overtime to fix his improvements. Your quiet revenge. Following his instructions to the letter until every doorknob in the house develops the same cloudy smear. It takes weeks for the housekeeper to admit your old, inefficient method worked better. Your veteran maid's secrets become legendary below stairs. The way a dab of gin cuts through tarnish faster than prayer. How buffing with yesterday's newspaper prevents streaks. Why you should always polish doorknobs clockwise on Sundays. The minister visits and his eyesight's failing. Historians will never find these tricks in household manuals. They're passed mouth to ear like forbidden lore, accompanied by warnings about which housekeepers notice which shortcuts. Your proudest moment comes when the new scullery maid teaches you a trick involving lemon rinds that actually works. The system collapses when the lady's nephew writes an article about servant efficiency and accidentally publishes your polishing cheat sheet. The resulting household inquiry is more thorough than the Boer War investigations.
The changing times arrive with the new century's first vacuum cleaner, a monstrous, wheezing contraption that terrifies the housemaids and fascinates the master. As you watch the footman struggle with its hose, you realize your polishing skills are becoming relics. The young mistresses chatter about modern homes needing modern solutions, their eyes sliding right past you as if you're already part of the past. Historians still argue whether technology liberated servants or made them obsolete. But the writing is literally on the newly installed electric light switches, fingerprint-proof chrome that never needs polishing. Your secret stash of beeswax and rags suddenly feels like a museum exhibit. Your small rebellion comes when you buff the old brass entrance knob to a mirror shine one last time, just enough to reflect the uncertain future in its surface. The house cat rubs against it approvingly, leaving the first of many new smudges. Your final polish isn't for the house at all. In your tiny rented room, you buff a single brass doorknob salvaged from Huntington Manor, the one from the servants' hall that no one but you ever cared for properly. The motion is meditation now, the rhythm unchanged after all these years. As the cloth moves in familiar circles, you realize something peculiar. This small, shining artifact contains entire worlds. The hands that shaped it, the hands that cleaned it. The lives that passed through its grasp. Somewhere between the tarnish and the shine, you found yourself. The afternoon light catches the knob's perfect surface one last time before you wrap it carefully in linen, a gift for the next generation of forgotten artisans. And so we leave our Edwardian maid, her hands at rest but her legacy gleaming softly in memory. Perhaps when you next turn an antique doorknob, you'll feel the echo of countless hands that came before, ordinary magic passed down through the mundane.
Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere blooming with gentle absurdity and royal obsession. You're standing on an old stone path in 17th century Istanbul. There's a warm breeze from the Bosphorus, and it carries the faint scent of rosewater, roasted lamb, and something surprisingly floral. Tulips. Not a few here and there, but everywhere, lining gardens, crowding palace courtyards, even painted on dishes and embroidered into slippers. This is not a quirky coincidence. You've stepped into a world where tulips were more than flowers, they were an empire-wide fascination. Now, if you're thinking, wait, flowers? For 2 hours? Well, yes. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this tulip-obsessed era. Not because it was dangerous, unless you stole a bulb, but because the level of devotion to these silky little petals might just wilt your modern sensibilities. Imagine spending a small fortune on a flower that dies in a week, and then bragging about it over sherbet with your equally tulip-mad friends. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you're listening from somewhere quiet or far-flung, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all dozing off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your stroll through a quiet Istanbul neighborhood, a part of the city long swallowed by time. The cobblestones click gently under your shoes, and you notice windows framed with iron grills curling in floral shapes. Even the shadows cast by lanterns seem to bloom. This was once a city obsessed, no, entranced, by the tulip. It's the early 1700s, near the peak of what later scholars would call the tulip era, a time when beauty, poetry, and delicate frivolity ruled the Ottoman elite. Historians still argue whether this era truly reflected the heart of the empire, or merely its distracted aristocracy, but the flowers were real, and the passion even more so. You pass through a garden gate, the wood worn smooth by generations of careful, flower-loving hands. Inside, tulips are organized like soldiers on parade, rows of red, orange, and violet, each petal meticulously symmetrical. You lean down and smell one. Nothing. It's true, most tulips, especially those prized by the Ottomans, were selected for appearance. Not scent. Form over fragrance. They were the supermodels of the flower world. The man tending the garden is older, robed in loose cotton dyed the color of turmeric. He nods without looking up. His fingers are deep in the earth, gently brushing soil from a bulb. Not just any bulb, this is a prized variety, worth perhaps as much as a good horse. He mutters to himself, probably something about the weather. Or maybe he's reciting tulip names in his head again. You'll learn soon that they weren't exactly subtle. You stroll further and spot a young boy delivering a tray of tea to a cluster of dignified men lounging on cushions under a silk canopy. They're not discussing war or taxes. They're debating whether a certain flame-tipped variety should be called candle of the beloved or blush of the moon. One man dramatically declares it should be both. The others murmur thoughtfully, even the language of tulips is rich with metaphor. To these men, a petal's curve mirrors a lover's cheek. A stem's posture might hint at melancholy. These weren't just flowers, they were emblems of refined taste, symbols of balance, symmetry, and, let's be honest, just a bit of delicious vanity. Here's a sleepy fact: during the tulip era, even the daily court calendar sometimes referenced flower blooming schedules. If a rare variety was expected to open on a Tuesday, courtiers might happen to be visiting that day. The flower might not notice. But the Sultan would. Speaking of the Sultan, you'll meet him soon, or at least, his favorite flowers. But for now, you pass a shop window filled with tiny ceramic tulip vases, each made to hold just a single stem. Why only one? Because one was enough. The more rare and elegant the flower, the more powerful the statement of restraint. Historians still debate the roots of this aesthetic obsession. Was it a spiritual pursuit of ephemeral beauty? A political distraction from a weakening empire? Or, as some argue, just an incredibly expensive hobby disguised as cultural virtue? Like if a modern government funded a national program for artisanal latte art, the garden you now walk through is part of a small public courtyard, backed by a mosque. Even here, tulips appear in tile work, carved into marble fountains, and stitched into prayer rugs. You realize you're being gently herded, not by people, but by petals. Their quiet repetition leads you from moment to moment, as though the entire city were softly whispering, "Look closer." And you do. You crouch beside a particularly dark bloom, so purple it's nearly black. Its velvety petals gleam under the moonlight. This, you learn, is a nightingale's shadow, a tulip so elusive that some collectors bribed gardeners for just one bulb. Not that you'd admit it, tulip trade was starting to get awkwardly competitive. Somewhere in the distance, a lute begins to play. You pause. It's not a concert, just a lone musician beside a fountain, playing for no one in particular. Or maybe for the tulips. You rest on a low bench beneath a cypress tree, and everything slows. The empire is busy, but here in this moment, with the warm stones under your legs and the whisper of leaves overhead. You linger on that stone bench a little longer, letting the night settle in around you. A cat wanders past, tail curling like a tulip stem, and you begin to wonder, how exactly did this all start? How did tulips, of all things, rise from dirt to divine symbol in the Ottoman world? To answer that, you have to go back. Way back. Before the Sultan's glowing gardens, before Ottoman poets started rhyming petal with eternal, and even before the city of Istanbul bore that name. Because tulips didn't start here. They started in the high, rocky slopes of Central Asia, in lands where nomads carried everything on horseback, including, yes, bulbs. The first tulips likely emerged in the Tian Shan Mountains, where wild varieties poked out of alpine soil like little botanical daredevils. Tough, wind-battered, and extremely unbothered by human admiration. Historians still argue whether these were intentionally cultivated by early Turkic tribes or just admired from afar, but we do know this: the flower traveled with the people. Literally. In saddlebags, as these nomads migrated westward, some of whom would later become the Seljuks, then the Ottomans, they brought their traditions, their tales, and occasionally, a bulb or two. Tulips began to pop up in Persia, where poets like Rumi started name-dropping them in dreamy verses. From there, the flower traveled further still, slipping into gardens across the Islamic world like a well-dressed hitchhiker. Picture a young Ottoman court in the 15th century, ambitious, powerful, and culturally hungry. They were drawing inspiration from everywhere: Persian literature, Arab science, Byzantine architecture, and when it came to flowers, the tulip stood out. It had elegance. It had symmetry. And crucially, it bloomed briefly, then vanished. This impermanence wasn't a flaw, it was seen as a spiritual metaphor. Life is fleeting. Beauty is fragile. Flowers die. So, carpe tulipa. Still, the tulip didn't become a full-blown obsession overnight. It had competition. Roses had long held the top spot in Islamic culture, praised for their scent, their association with divine love, and their practicality. Rosewater was everywhere. But tulips? They were more enigmatic. And far less useful. Which, naturally, made them feel luxurious. You reach a quiet stone bridge and pause, watching the moonlight ripple in the water below. A boat drifts past, lanterns swaying gently. Somewhere in that boat, centuries ago, a royal gardener may have been carrying a crate of bulbs, fresh from Persia or maybe even further east. The empire was expanding, and with it, its collection of botanical treasures. By the 16th century, the tulip had firmly rooted itself in Ottoman soil, both literal and metaphorical. The court of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had begun importing and cultivating more exotic varieties, especially those with jagged edges, deep colors, and unusual striations. Sultan Suleiman, known for his poetry and flair for dramatic outfits, was naturally drawn to a flower that looked like it wore eyeliner. And here's a fringe tidbit: some early tulip varieties were thought to be omens. A particularly dark bloom could be read as a warning. A double-headed tulip might signal a twist in fate. Was this superstition? Symbolism? Botanically inclined paranoia? Historians still debate just how seriously these interpretations were taken, but they were recorded. You keep walking, and as you pass under a low stone arch, you glimpse a tile mosaic, tulips again. But these are stylized, elongated and almost abstract. This wasn't an accident. Ottoman artists deliberately exaggerated the tulip's form, drawing it tall and thin, like a candle flickering in the wind. It became the ideal tulip shape, and soon, growers began trying to cultivate real flowers that looked like the art. That's right, the Ottomans didn't just grow tulips. They curated them, designed them, even bred them for aesthetics the same way modern influencers edit photos. Long petals, tight cups, bold stripes. They were seeking visual perfection in nature, and they got surprisingly close. By now, you're starting to see how this tulip thing got out of hand. It wasn't just about liking flowers, it was about expressing taste, wealth, refinement, and the kind of soft power that whispers rather than shouts. A carefully arranged tulip bed said, "I have time. I have knowledge. I have beauty under my control." The irony, of course, is that beauty can't be controlled. Not for long. The most prized tulip varieties, often caused by viral infections in the bulb, were notoriously unstable. You'd plant one expecting red and gold stripes, and the next year, you'd get a plain orange dud. This didn't stop the obsession, it made the flowers even more valuable. Rare, unpredictable, and short-lived. The perfect status symbol, so now you know, the Ottomans didn't invent the tulip. But they did turn it into an object of desire, a symbol of sophistication, and eventually, a centerpiece of an entire cultural moment. A gentle breeze brushes past your face. You hear distant laughter from a garden behind high walls, followed by a splash, probably someone dropping a sherbet glass into a fountain again. You smile. Life in the tulip era wasn't fast-paced. It was about the slow, deliberate enjoyment of details. The slant of a shadow. The exact hue of a petal, and just like that, you step back onto the path, ready to see how this quiet floral admiration evolved into something far more extravagant. You turn a corner and step into a new garden, larger this time, grander. Here, the hedges are clipped with ceremonial precision, and the walkways are inlaid with polished stones that shimmer like mica under the soft glow of lanterns. This isn't just someone's private escape. It's part of the Topkapi Palace grounds, the heart of Ottoman imperial life for centuries. And during the tulip era, this place didn't just run on political power, it ran on flower power. Imagine being invited here in the early 1700s. You'd arrive by boat along the Bosphorus, glide through gates guarded by eunuchs and janissaries, and be escorted through arched passageways into private gardens where tulips greeted you like noble courtiers. You'd think it a dream, or maybe the result of too much pomegranate wine. But no, it's real, and in this moment, you're standing right in the middle of it. The air smells faintly of jasmine and clay. Birds chirp sleepily from mulberry trees. And all around you, tulips seem to glow with an otherworldly pride, as if aware of their elite status. These are the Sultan's tulips. Grown by royal gardeners, guarded by palace protocol, and catalogued in obsessively detailed ledgers that read more like poetry anthologies than gardening manuals, the Sultan at the time, Ahmed III, a ruler with a fondness for leisure and refined taste, was the man who would elevate this gentle floral pastime into a full-blown imperial identity. Historians still argue whether he genuinely adored tulips or simply leaned into their popularity to soften his own political image. Either way, his reign, 1703 to 1730, is now synonymous with one thing: the tulip era, or Lale Devri in Ottoman Turkish. A court official glides by, balancing a tray of delicate sweets, pistachio halva, rose-flavored lokum, and candied violet petals. He offers you one. You take it, and it dissolves on your tongue like perfume, but even among all this elegance, a quirky detail sticks out. One of the musicians is wearing a sash embroidered with the name of his favorite tulip variety. That's not strange here. Tulip names were a whole thing. Elaborate, poetic, sometimes hilarious. You might encounter names like Face of the Beloved, Tipsy Whisper, or Moonlight on saffron silk. Some were more absurdly specific: the jealous heart of the glassmaker's widow. Historians still chuckle over whether those were inside jokes or just the empire's version of artisanal branding. You stroll deeper into the garden, passing a section where gardeners crouch in hushed conversation. They aren't talking about soil. They're gossiping, tulip gossip. Someone's prized bulb failed to bloom. Another showed unexpected stripes. There are whispers that one nobleman tried to dye his tulips to maintain social standing. The horror. The scandal. Tulip competition was fierce. Among the courtly elite, status wasn't just measured by silk and jewels anymore, it was measured by your garden. Owning a rare tulip bulb was like owning a limited edition sports car today. You showed it off. You protected it. You hired security to guard it. Yes, that actually happened, and if your bulb failed to produce, you could always commission a miniature painting of what it should have looked like and quietly hint at your misfortune being a poetic tragedy. That way, you still got the clout without the bloom. The Sultan himself encouraged this tulip fever. He hosted competitions, rewarded gardeners, and even commissioned new palace gardens entirely devoted to showcasing floral symmetry. One of his favorites was a crescent-shaped bed designed to bloom at dawn, so that the tulips caught the first golden light and cast long. A court official glides by, balancing a tray of delicate sweets, pistachio halva, rose-flavored locum, and candied violet petals. He offers you one. You take it, and it dissolves on your tongue like perfume, but even in this dainty world of petals and poetry, politics lingered. Historians still debate how much of this opulence was sincere and how much was performative, a kind of soft power theater meant to distract from external threats and internal unrest. The empire was changing. Europe was industrializing. Borders were shifting. Yet here, in this floral microcosm, time seemed frozen in syrup. As night deepens, lanterns are lit, each one shaped like a tulip in bloom. You notice the faint buzz of insects, drawn by the glow, and realize the party is about to begin. Guests in flowing robes arrive in clusters, their laughter light and rhythmic. Musicians begin a gentle tune. Somewhere, a poet clears his throat and prepares to recite. You sit beneath a flowering plum tree and exhale. This world is absurdly, unapologetically beautiful. It doesn't apologize for its excess or try to justify its pleasures. It just exists, soft, slow, and wrapped in silk. A quiet rebellion against the noise of history, and as the lanterns sway and the tulips tilt gently in the night air, you begin to see why an entire empire once paused. For a flower. The music from the garden fades behind you as you follow a winding marble corridor back toward the quieter edges of the palace complex. It's darker here, less polished. You're leaving the party, not rudely, just slipping away for a bit, as if your subconscious is tugging you toward the roots of all this. Toward the economics of obsession, because as romantic as it is to imagine nobles composing sonnets to tulips by moonlight, someone had to grow the things. Someone had to sell them. And someone, inevitably, had to try to get rich off them. Yes, we've arrived at the tulip trade. Back in the early 18th century, tulips were more than pretty faces. They were commodities. Carefully bred. Meticulously catalogued, and bought and sold like precious stones. You'd think they were rare spices from the East, or NFTs with petals. And just like with any hot new asset, speculation bloomed. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman tulip craze ever reached full-on market bubble status like the Dutch tulip mania of the 1630s, but make no mistake, tulip inflation was real. A single bulb could sell for more than the yearly salary of a senior bureaucrat. Rare varieties were whispered about like secret spells. If you had Fire of Baghdad or Lamenting Nightfall, you didn't just have a flower. You had bragging rights, and this didn't stay inside the palace walls. Wealthy merchants, guild leaders, even artisans got in on the tulip game. Some transformed their inner courtyards into private tulip showrooms. Others tried to one-up each other with exclusive blooms sourced through convoluted, cloak-and-dagger-like gardener networks. The phrase bulb smuggler doesn't appear in most history books, but rest assured, they existed. Faint torchlight flickers against painted ceilings. This is where public auctions sometimes took place. Buyers sat on cushions, sipping hot drinks, watching as prized tulips were unveiled with the ceremony usually reserved for rare manuscripts or baby princes. And here's the odd part, many of the most valuable tulips weren't grown from seed, but from division of bulbs, a slow and finicky process. This meant supply was always limited. Combine that with the instability of certain virus-affected varieties, the ones with the showiest stripes and flares, and you had a perfect storm of scarcity and desire. It got a little ridiculous. Stories circulated of households mortgaging property for a chance at a bulb. Of artisans secretly planting bulbs inside their chimneys to hide them from jealous neighbors. Of a man who traded a prized horse for a tulip that died in transport. Was that apocryphal? Probably. But even if half these stories are exaggerated, the fact they exist at all speaks volumes. Not everyone was enchanted. The religious scholars, ulama, were skeptical. Some viewed the tulip craze as a dangerous distraction from piety and duty. Others saw it as just another vice of the idle rich. A few wrote sermons that casually compared tulip obsession to gambling or vanity. A flower, they warned, should not rival God in a man's heart. Though notably, many of those same scholars still kept well-tended rose gardens. You stop at a small domed kiosk where a clerk in a red felt hat once recorded garden inventories. His job? Keeping track of tulip stocks for the palace. Not by number, but by poetic category: flame types, needle petals, black-throated, moon-faced, love-withered. It's like trying to run a bank using interpretive dance, and yet, it worked. More or less. Of course, with money involved, envy grew. Tulip theft became a low-key crime wave. Garden walls were reinforced. Guards were posted. In one recorded case, a disgruntled gardener tried to swap out a high-ranking vizier's bulbs with common street varieties. The scandal was narrowly avoided, but the gossip lasted a decade, and still the demand grew. New gardening manuals were printed, lavishly illustrated with delicate watercolor renderings. These weren't just for growers, they were status symbols, proudly displayed in libraries and salons. You imagine leafing through one now, the thick parchment still smelling of ink and spice, each page a love letter to geometry and color, but beneath all this surface beauty, something was beginning to rot. Prices were unstable. Bulbs were failing. And worse still, the empire itself was showing signs of strain. Borders were being tested. External enemies watched with interest as the Ottomans threw extravagant lantern parties while trade routes faltered and the army quietly declined in discipline. Some historians argue the tulip boom masked deeper issues: economic stagnation, rising inequality, a widening gap between the ruling elite and the everyday citizens who were decidedly not attending nightly garden banquets. And yet, the flowers kept blooming. You step into another courtyard, smaller this time, quiet. A few faded tulips poke up from worn soil. Their stems are crooked. One leans dramatically to the left like it's staging a protest. You bend down and notice the tag, "Silent Dust of Evening." Even the sad ones had poetic names. It's easy to mock all this, to laugh at how seriously they took their tulips. But then again, what were they really doing? Creating beauty in a world that often had too little of it. Searching for balance. For control. For grace, and yes, maybe also for bragging rights. You sit on the low garden wall, watching a cat bat gently at a fallen petal. The city beyond the walls hums softly. It's easy to forg. You stretch your legs a little and step away from the shadowy garden. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale calls, clear, musical, a little theatrical. It's the kind of sound that makes you feel like you've been dropped inside a watercolor painting. Which is fitting, because in the Ottoman Empire, tulips weren't just garden fixtures or economic darlings. They were symbols. Visual metaphors. Design motifs. And, somehow, divine reminders. This is the section of our dream walk where we drift into the art and symbolism of the tulip. You find yourself inside a tiled corridor. Every surface is glazed in brilliant blues and greens, typical of Ottoman chini ceramics, but your eye keeps catching flashes of red and white, tulips. Curving, stylized, repeating. Always facing upward. There's a rhythm to them, a kind of sacred choreography in pigment. The tulip, or lail in Ottoman Turkish, wasn't just a botanical darling, it was a spiritual emblem. Historians still debate how far this symbolism was genuinely theological versus just a really elegant design trend, but here's the fascinating part: the word lail shares the same Arabic letters as Allah when written in Ottoman script. Coincidence? Theologians said no. Gardeners said cool. Sultan said, "We'll take 12 dozen tiles of that." And so, tulips began appearing everywhere, on mosque domes, on the sides of prayer rugs, inside illuminated Qurans. You pass into a smaller chamber now, once part of a sultan's private quarters, and see the flower again, woven into cushion covers, etched into lantern glass, embroidered onto silk robes. It's not overkill. Somehow, the repetition becomes calming. You pause to admire a single painted panel. A lone tulip stretches heavenward, slightly bowed as if in prayer. It's flanked by arabesque vines and tiny pomegranate blossoms. There's a whisper of incense in the air, and you realize you're not just in a palace room, you're in a kind of floral chapel. For the Ottomans, beauty wasn't just aesthetic. It was divine order made visible. Symmetry, in particular, was a big deal. It signaled balance between this world and the next. And the tulip, with its radial petals and clean elegance, fit that vision perfectly. No thorns, no chaos, just upward bloom. Ottoman miniaturists loved tulips too. You imagine flipping through a tiny manuscript filled with illustrations of court life. Even in scenes of warfare or diplomacy, there's always a tulip peeking in somewhere, planted along a path, stitched into a soldier's sash, or simply balancing in a vase on a scribe's desk. Like a reminder that even in the mess of history, beauty sneaks in, of course. Tulips didn't just decorate spiritual and royal spaces, they also snuck into the lives of everyday Ottomans. You pass by an open window now, and glance inside a modest home. The furniture is simple, but there's a clay pot with a single tulip on the windowsill. Even here, in the home of someone whose job probably involved more broom than brush, the flower is present. In the markets of Istanbul, women once wore tulip-patterned veils. Young lovers might exchange tiny tulip-shaped amulets, carved from ivory or bone. Soap sellers molded their wares into fragrant little blooms. Children even played with carved wooden tulip toys, rolling them along alleyways like mini chariots. Tulips were omnipresent. But they weren't loud. There's something understated in the way the Ottomans wove them into the visual fabric of life. Never gaudy. Never overbright. Always just elegant. Even their most ornate versions felt like whispers, but not all whispers are quiet. You enter a new room, larger, echoing. It once held diplomatic meetings. Above you, the domed ceiling is painted with stars, but between them, yes, more tulips. Painted in gold leaf, they catch the light like secret eyes. This was where the empire's most sensitive negotiations happened. And still, the tulips watched. Historians still argue whether this floral abundance ever became excessive. Were the Ottomans over-romanticizing their empire's image? Were they trying to lull themselves into believing that everything was blooming, even as the ground beneath them shifted? Maybe. But here's a softer take: maybe they just believed that beauty itself could be a kind of diplomacy. A gift of tulip bulbs was considered a gesture of peace. Foreign envoys often left Istanbul with bundles of rare varieties. One Austrian ambassador wrote home that he was more confused by the Ottomans' obsession with bulb sizes than by their foreign policy. He described it as botanical theater, which honestly sounds like a great band name. You walk to a nearby fountain, one of those indoor types that burble gently for ambience. It's shaped, of course, like a tulip in bloom. The water spills softly from the petal edges into a shallow marble basin. You dip your fingers in. It's cool and surprisingly sweet, infused with rose, perhaps, and then, just beside the fountain, you notice a small inscription carved into the stone. It's a couplet in Ottoman Turkish, florid and looping, but a whispered translation comes to mind: the flower blooms, not to be seen, but to remember its maker. You sit by the fountain for a moment, letting the silence wrap around you like gauze. Outside, you can hear the night still stirring gently, an owl, a distant cartwheel, the breeze through cypress trees. You begin to see the tulip not as a symbol of wealth or ego, but of transience. The petals open, shine briefly, then fall. The Ottomans knew this. That's why they wrote so many poems about it. About how even the most beautiful flower must fade. It was melancholy, but not tragic. A quiet nod to impermanence. A reminder, perhaps, to love harder while the tulip still blooms, and right now, in this moment, it still does. You rise slowly from the fountain, water droplets cooling your fingertips. The night air has shifted slightly, warmer now, thick with the scent of wet stone and something faintly spicy, like cinnamon bark left in the sun. You're still wrapped in the scent of tulips, though it's hard to say if it's real or imagined. The flower has seeped into everything by now, your thoughts, your path, your breath. Now, let's leave the palace. You drift beyond the gates, down into the winding, uneven streets of 18th century Istanbul. The city at night is not sleeping, it murmurs. Distant footsteps, a clatter of hooves on cobbles, a lullaby echoing from a high window. Cats stalk rooftops like sleepy acrobats. But you're focused on something else tonight: how tulips changed daily life for the people, not just the palace, because while the upper classes might have had grand gardens and delicate poems, the tulip reached beyond silk robes and gold-leafed manuscripts. It found its way into the lives of tailors, spice vendors, lamp makers, and bricklayers. You pass by a small coffee house. Inside, men sit cross-legged on low cushions, passing around cups of bitter Turkish coffee so thick it's practically chewable. Above them, on a wall painted years ago in the slightly uncertain hand of a local artist, is, you guessed it, a tulip. It's lopsided, maybe even a little droopy, but it's definitely there. And next to it, written in a wobbly Ottoman script, "Beauty sleeps in quiet things." The tulip craze filtered into fashion too. Women in the city's wealthier neighborhoods started wearing tulip-inspired embroidery, on scarves, cuffs, even shoes. Not gaudy, just confident. Meanwhile, tailors invented new styles of robes and waistcoats with floral linings, hidden away like secret gardens. Children learned rhymes about tulips. One popular ditty went something like, "The rose is proud, the jasmine shy, but the tulip only sighs. It doesn't really make sense, but that's the charm of nursery rhymes, isn't?" It doesn't really make sense, but that's the charm of nursery rhymes, isn't it? You turn into a marketplace that's mostly closed for the night. The canvas awnings droop like sleepy eyelids. But in the moonlight, you can still make out a tulip carved into a stall beam, half worn away by decades of hands and weather. A silent reminder of a time when flower bulbs were more coveted than spices. One quirky fact from this era: tulip-based perfumes became a minor industry. Distilling scent from actual tulip petals is wildly inefficient, but that didn't stop ambitious apothecaries from trying. Some blended tulip petals with more potent florals, rose, musk, clove, and called it the Sultan's whisper. Historians still argue whether any of these mixtures actually smelled good or just smelled expensive, but that didn't matter, because to wear tulip perfume was to signal something: delicacy, refinement, and just a whisper of indulgence. And who could resist that? Artisans, too, found inspiration in tulip shapes. Potters molded vases to mimic the flower's silhouette. Lampmakers crafted glass lanterns shaped like bulbs, which glowed with pinkish hues when lit. Even bakers got involved, creating sweet rolls coiled like tulip petals, filled with fig paste or crushed pistachios. The taste? Probably confusing. The effort? Impressive. You stop near a quiet corner where a well once stood. A plaque nearby, modern now, chipped, says this was once the meeting spot for Istanbul's midnight gardeners, a group of hobbyists who snuck into public green spaces at night to swap bulbs and gossip. Picture a tulip-themed book club mixed with mild trespassing. Their motto, scrawled in the margins of an old gardening book: "We plant in silence, but bloom in mischief," and it wasn't all just surface level. Even the postal service got involved, seriously. For a brief time in the early 18th century, the Ottoman Postal Authority used tulip stamps to denote elite correspondence, tiny red stamps pressed onto wax seals. It was probably just branding, but imagine the drama of receiving a letter with a tulip seal. Ah yes, this must be urgent and also extremely fashionable, yet for all its charm, the tulip's reach wasn't always embraced. Some grumbled that the tulip obsession felt forced. That it made everything too precious, too soft, too floral. One critic famously called the period an empire trapped in a bouquet. You can picture him sighing into his tea, annoyed that his boots now came with petal trim, and yet, resistance faded. Tulips just kept showing up, in ironwork, in recipes, even in lullabies. They became part of the subconscious fabric of the city, like pigeons or fairy horns or the smell of roasted chestnuts. You round a bend and arrive at a tiny shrine, unassuming, almost hidden by ivy. A clay jug filled with real tulips sits on the stone steps, left by someone not long ago. You don't know why. Maybe for luck. Maybe in memory. Maybe just because beauty, sometimes, needs no explanation. You sit for a moment. Istanbul stretches out around you, all tangled alleys and whispered stories. Somewhere nearby, a baker is kneading dough by lantern light. A cat brushes past your ankle and disappears. A single tulip petal falls beside you on the stone. And you realize that for the people of this empire, tulips weren't just flowers. They were an atmosphere. A mood. A quiet rebellion against dust and war and deadlines. A way of saying, yes, the world is complicated, but look at this bloom.